Now the bankers, with their sights set on a central bank, had almost all of their ducks in a row. With allies in control of both American government and industry, only one thing stood in their way: the attitudes of the American public. Americans had become fearful of the great power that was being amassed in the hands of a few wealthy men. This was compounded when Harriman and Morgan, who had been fighting over control of the Northern Pacific Railroad, decided to set aside their differences and form a large trust. The Northern Securities Company, which Rockefeller got a piece of as well, combined several northern railroads under one umbrella. Teddy Roosevelt decided to attack both Northern Securities and Standard Oil for antitrust violations. These lawsuits culminated in the breakup of both monopolies. In 1907, while all of this trust busting was going on, there was a financial panic started by a run on the Knickerbocker Trust Company. J.P. Morgan intervened and saved the nation from a crash. What few realized was that before Morgan stepped in to stop the panic, he helped create it. Doctor of Law and author Ellen Brown described the panic and its significance aptly. The Panic of 1907 was triggered by rumors that two major banks were about to become insolvent. Later evidence pointed to the House of Morgan as the source of the rumors. The public, believing the rumors, proceeded to make them come true by staging a run on the banks. Morgan then nobly stepped in to avert the panic by importing $100 million in gold from his European sources. The public thus became convinced that the country needed a central banking system to stop future panics, overcoming strong congressional opposition to any bill allowing the nation's money to be issued by a private central bank controlled by Wall Street. This was all well understood at the time by some. In 1913, House Representative Charles Lindbergh Sr. stated into the congressional record, "The money trust caused the 1907 panic and thereby forced Congress to create a National Monetary Commission." The National Monetary Commission was formed to study ways to stabilize the U.S. financial system. The commission finally made its recommendation after traveling around Europe for 2 years on the country's tab. What the country really needed was, can you guess? A central bank. Which is no surprise. The commission's leader, the powerful senator from Rhode Island, Nelson Aldrich, held shares in New York's biggest banks. His daughter Abby married John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Yes, Nelson Aldrich was David Rockefeller's grandfather. What about Teddy Roosevelt? Where did his loyalties lie? Roosevelt, like his fifth cousin Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was from a wealthy Dutch family who are connected by marriage to the Astors. The Roosevelt, Delano, and Astor families literally intertwine like threads in a rug. Like the Astors, the Roosevelts held large tracts of land in Manhattan, which Teddy's great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Claus van Roosevelt, purchased back when New York was still a Dutch colony. Roosevelt was known to be a Morgan man, was friends with Edward Harriman, and had accepted campaign contributions from Rockefeller. Both Roosevelt and his longtime friend and Secretary of State, Elihu Root, helped further the agenda of the money trust in many ways. So if Roosevelt was on the side of the bankers, why did he attack Standard Oil and Northern Securities? There is only one reasonable explanation. It was a ploy to allay public fears. It convinced the nation that the politicians were on the side of the people and that the power of the monopolists had been checked. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Rockefeller was hardly inconvenienced by the attack. The 34 small pieces the Supreme Court broke Standard Oil up into were still Rockefeller-controlled companies. The family's stock values doubled with the restructuring, and 4 of those new companies would later become Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and Amoco. I don't think Jefferson, who rallied against central banking at America's inception, or Lincoln, who tried to free the American people from debt-based privately issued currency, or Washington, who warned against unnecessary wars and foreign entanglements, are much too happy to have Teddy Roosevelt sitting up there with them on Mount Rushmore. Roosevelt's trust busting accomplished one other thing. It kept the spotlight off of what the bankers were really up to. In 1910, 7 men got on a train headed for Jekyll Island, Georgia, ostensibly to do some duck hunting. Nelson Aldrich was among them, as was Paul Warburg, and representatives of the Rockefeller and Morgan banking interests. Also there was Abram Andrews, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. The men took precautions to ensure complete secrecy and referred to each other only by their first names. Over the next 10 days, they hammered out the details of what would become the Federal Reserve System. The proposal was originally introduced in Congress as the Aldrich Plan, but was shot down. Paul Warburg rewrote it under the name the Federal Reserve Act, which Senator Aldrich publicly opposed to try and fool the other congressmen. The two bills were essentially the same. Lest we forget who was ultimately behind this, an agent of Brown Brothers, Colonel Elisha Garrison, wrote in his 1931 book, Roosevelt, Wilson, and the Federal Reserve Law. Paul Warburg is the man who got the Federal Reserve Act together after the Aldrich Plan aroused such nationwide resentment and opposition. The mastermind of both plans was Baron Alfred Rothschild of London. The act passed the House and Senate in late December of 1913, and the differences were hammered out while most congressmen were out of town for the holidays. It is debatable whether Woodrow Wilson, who signed the bill the next day, fully understood the nature of what he was a party to, or if he was simply a puppet. Certainly, Colonel Edward M. House deserves much of the credit for Wilson's cooperation. House's father had made his fortune running blockades during the Civil War and trading with British investors, including the Rothschilds. Colonel House was solidly in the inner circle of the money trust and was Wilson's most trusted advisor, maintaining a residence in the White House. Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law on December 23, 1913. Jacob Schiff sent a letter to Colonel House, thanking him.